As I said to David earlier, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to give these talks. It's taken me into new material and new areas, and I have to learn such a lot in order to give the talk, but I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. Of course, we're thinking of cataclysm and now cataclysm in the future. And in a subsection of that, which I'm calling global catastrophe, because we're talking of things that are going to happen globally. And I think we've got to about part 5 within this subsection. And of course, we're now dealing with the character that we've come to know as the Antichrist. And we talked about him last week, actually. Amazing. We were able to do that just a week ago. And that's up on YouTube. And of course, we based it on this passage in the second letter to the Thessalonians, written by, of course, the Apostle Paul. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. And of course, I highlighted 3 subjects, and we dealt with 2 of them in the opening introductory talk. We needed to think about what is the rebellion that has to occur before the day comes. It will not happen until the rebellion occurs, and we came to understand that the Greek word gives us our English word apostasy, and we talked about that. And of course we mentioned also Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 24, that the love of most will grow cold because of the increase in lawlessness. That's all to say about that, but I can refer you back to that opening talk. We went on to talk about, or try to understand, who the man of lawlessness might be. The fact is, he has to be revealed. That's what the Apostle Paul says in his letter to the Thessalonians. And we looked at various archetypes, what we could call archetypes of the Antichrist in antiquity. And again, I'll refer you back to that introductory talk. And we started to compile a list, basically, of certain characteristics that the future Antichrist might display. None of these archetypes will have them all. The final Antichrist, I think, will fulfill every aspect of the character of the man of lawlessness. That's all to say about what we dealt with last time, but I refer you back to that talk. We finished really asking the question, where is God's temple? But we didn't get into it, but now we will get into it. And of course, one of the popular eschatological expectations amongst many, particularly people that we could call dispensationalists, is that there will be a third temple built on the Temple Mount. And of course, here's a photo or a picture of the Temple Mount 2022. It will look like this. Of course, we see the Islamic shrine, which is the Dome of the Rock, and we look at the actual mosque, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I'm not expecting another temple on the Temple Mount for several reasons. One is, I think the Lord himself has put the Temple Mount out of bounds to Jewish people. Just think of one Jewish person going up to pray on the Temple Mount and the furore that follows that. But more than that, I predict, this is a prediction, it's not a certainty, I predict that the earthquake that we've spoken about in days gone by, several times ago now, what I'm calling Ezekiel's earthquake, will actually destroy the Temple Mount. That's what I believe. That will be one of the main reasons why I don't think it will be possible to build what people describe as the third temple, but actually, we talked about that as well. Is it really a third temple, or is it a fourth temple, or is it a fifth temple? Anyway, never mind. Of course, the earthquake fault we've looked at in talks gone by, which goes so close to the Temple Mount, and of course some of the major earthquakes that have taken place in Israel's history have actually damaged the Temple Mount or the temple itself. Even Uzziah's earthquake, we talked about it a lot, several talks ago now. So will there be another temple on this Temple Mount? You've obviously got the message. I don't think so. Oh, it's so easy to prove you wrong, Geoff, here, because when they build one, you'll have to come back and say, oh, I got it wrong. And I might get it wrong. It's okay. We don't know all the details of what's going to take place in the future. But I still do not think so, and I will explain more and more why I think that to be the case. I need to explain why I feel quite strongly that there won't be another temple built on this Temple Mount. So let's think about God's temple. What does Paul actually say in 2 Thessalonians? He, that's the man of lawlessness, we come to know him as the Antichrist, he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. But Paul also says something else in another of his letters about what he believes to be God's temple. And we find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 2 verses 16 and 17. This is what the Apostle Paul says about God's temple. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, even such a man of lawlessness, God will destroy him. Remember, the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, is doomed to destruction. We talked about it. For God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple. I think it's clear. Paul says, you are that temple. In other words, for the Apostle Paul, God's temple is not a building at all. It's a people. It's the people of God. You could even call them the elect. However, we need to consider an objection to my position. Don't you know, Geoff, that Revelation chapter 11 describes a temple? Therefore, what does that mean? Well, what does John, the Apostle John, actually say? Actually going back into chapter 10 of the book of Revelation. This begins a new section in the book of Revelation, in my opinion. We've talked about sequences of events, initially the opening of the seals and then the sounding of the trumpets. We talked about that. And then, right at the very end of chapter 10 in the book of Revelation, John, who wrote the book of Revelation, says this: "Then I was told, you must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, languages, and kings." Okay, you can see that this verse is telling us that we're moving into a new place, a different section within the book of Revelation. That's the last verse of Revelation chapter 10. Now this is the first 2 verses of Revelation chapter 11. I was given a reed like a measuring rod and was told by the angel, actually, go and measure the temple of God and the altar, and count the worshippers there. But exclude the outer court, do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. Okay, now what is this? What is John doing here? I believe that this is a prophetic action, that the angel is asking the Apostle John to perform. Remember Ezekiel in 2 times ago now, the talk that we gave on the day of the Lord. Ezekiel was asked to do a prophetic action. It was to cut his hair and weigh the hair. But here, John is actually given a measuring rod to go and measure the temple. Actually, the only temple that John could have measured to fulfill this prophetic action is Herod's temple. Here's a picture. Let's think about it. Herod's temple. It did have a court of the Gentiles. Here you see another picture of a model of Herod's temple, and here you see the court of the Gentiles. And what does it say in Revelation chapter 11 verse 2? But exclude the outer court, do not measure it, because it's been given to the Gentiles, goes on, they will trample on the holy city for 42 months. I highlight the word trample, because we're going to think about it in more detail in a moment. So we need to know some dates here, and we've got information to draw on. We need to consider the First Jewish-Roman War. For example, it actually began with a rebellion. Now that's interesting. It began with a rebellion in the year 66 AD, which happened to be the 12th year of the Emperor Nero. Vespasian, who was going to become emperor, of course we talked about that last time, he actually landed in April 67 AD. Ultimately, Vespasian was to become emperor. Do you remember the year of the 4 emperors? AD 69, that took place after Nero died, possibly committed suicide. Vespasian, who had been in charge of the troops, handed over that responsibility to his son Titus, who was to become emperor after Vespasian died. Titus began the siege of Jerusalem, which lasted 7 months, apparently. How do we know this? Tell me how we know this, folks. We know it because of the writing of Josephus, and I think this is really significant that Josephus, who handed himself over to the Romans, of course, he was a turncoat, one might say, nevertheless gave us an enormous amount of information that helps us understand what might happen in the future, of course. And remember, the siege of Jerusalem lasted 7 months. Now that's a fair amount of time. And Jesus says, particularly in the Olivet Discourse as recorded in the book of Luke, I think myself that Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse in part is speaking to Jesus' first century disciples, because he says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Remember, Jesus said, look, your house is left to you desolate. And remember, of course, that there is ultimately to be an abomination that causes desolation. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. It's not there yet, but it's near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. We talked about this last time, more particularly what took place in the 2nd century in the last talk, in the days of Emperor Hadrian. And I asked the question and tried to answer it then. Why was it important to flee to the mountains? Well, Jesus said this, actually also written or recorded by Luke, interestingly enough, in Acts chapter 1 verse 8, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." So there was time to flee. Jesus needed his disciples to hear his words and to act on them, because for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. And the gospel had to go ultimately to the ends of the earth. It's going to take a time. Jesus knew that. It wasn't going to happen in a week or a month or a year. In fact, it's taken 2,000 years. It continues. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. For God so loved the world. The temple was destroyed on Tish B'Av, which is a day of mourning, because the first temple was destroyed on Tish B'Av as well, when the Babylonian armies destroyed Jerusalem. That was in late July, 70 AD. Now, we note the horror of what took place on Tish B'Av and in the days around it in 70 AD. It is thought that 1.1 million people actually died, Jewish people, Israelis actually died at that time. It goes on though, the First Jewish-Roman War, and probably is brought to a close when Masada, which is so close to where I live, folks, it fell on April the 16th, 73 AD. If you begin at 66 AD and you end on April the 16th, 73 AD, you have a 7-year period, which I think is very significant. And in addition to that, half of a 7-year period is 42 months. And it says in Revelation chapter 11 verse 2, they, the Gentiles, will trample on the holy city for 42 months, which is half the time of a 7-year period. And of course, at this time, the Great Diaspora begins. This is what Jesus says. They're very solemn words. Again, of course, written and recorded by Luke, his account of the Olivet Discourse. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jesus is anticipating a lot of time here. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There's that word again, trampled. Well, Jesus goes on, it's not forever. Jesus then speaks that it is until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The question is, when were they fulfilled? Was it now, as shown in this picture, on June the 7th, 1967, when the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, actually recaptured Jerusalem and it became under Jewish sovereignty, or at least most of it, first time in 2,000 years nearly? Or was it here? I think you know what this picture is. This is an ancient photograph of Auschwitz. And we're coming in a few days' time to the 27th of January, which is International Holocaust Memorial Day. And of course, next Saturday there will be a special service or memorial event in Wimborne Minster, remembering the significance of the Holocaust. Were the times of the Gentiles fulfilled here? I don't know. But the fact is, remarkably, that both in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, 1.1 million people died, and it is said that in Auschwitz, 1.1 million people died. It's as though these two events delineate what I think one might call the time of Jacob's trouble, which reaches its climax in the Holocaust. This is my thinking. Okay, let's move on and reconsider some of these ancient archetypes, because there's something else very important that I want to say about particularly three people. Antiochus Epiphanes, Nero in the 1st century, and Hadrian in the 2nd century. AD, of course, in that particular instance. I could put more faces here. Of course, we considered some other faces, Vespasian. You could even include King Herod, I suppose, amongst this group. But I just wanted to show these three in particular because there's a particular characteristic which I think to be a prophetic motif that was true for each of these. Because in each case, a covenant was made by the Jewish people with the person illustrated here who actually is the enemy. This is definitely true in the 2nd century BC. The covenant that was made with Antiochus Epiphanes, the manifest God, somebody who declares himself to be God. But that was also true in the 1st century. An attempt by the Jewish leadership to make an agreement with Nero so that the sacrifices could continue. But it's also true in the 2nd century AD with the Emperor Hadrian, who gave for a little while encouragement to the Jewish leadership that he would enable them to rebuild the temple. Of course, from AD 70 to 130 whatevers AD, you got coming up for 70 years. There was a messianic expectation that the temple that was destroyed in AD 70 could be rebuilt in the days of Hadrian. Of course, it never happened. It led to rebellions. A rebellion in the 2nd century BC was the Maccabean revolt. The rebellion in the 1st century AD was the first Jewish-Roman war, ultimately. And in the 2nd century, the rebellion was the Bar Kokhba revolt, which led to hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives being lost. And actually the parting of the ways between Messianic Jews and, if you like, Orthodox Pharisaic Jews. The 2nd century was very dramatic in that. Now, when we consider the word covenant with these enemies, I can refer to something that is very historically accurate in the 2nd century BC. He, that's Antiochus Epiphanes, will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. What we're talking about here, we're talking of 7 years. This is why a 7-year period is so significant. And in the middle, after 42 months of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. This is historically true of what took place in the 2nd century BC. It is also true in the days of Nero. It's also true in the days of Hadrian. It's a prophetic motif that is repeated throughout history. One might even think that the whole of history is built on 7-year periods. Now, from a biblical Judaic perspective, one can understand that. We're in a Shemitah year, for example, which happens every 7 years. So the 7-year prophetic motif is something that is repeated throughout history. Okay, that's antiquity. Let us fast forward to the 19th century. We could stop at different times throughout that period, but we'd be here all day if we did that. But particularly, I want to go to the 19th century and to consider this person, Napoleon Bonaparte. Why would you want to do that, Geoff? Well, the fact is, there was an attempt by Napoleon, actually in the year 1799, during the Battle of Acre. Napoleon wanted the Jewish people, he wanted them to enlist, or at least to support his efforts. And this was a declaration that he gave in 1799 in Constantinople. And I'll just show one thing. This is what Napoleon wanted to do and encourage Jewish people, the Israeli people at that time, to enlist in his army and to support his efforts to re-establish ancient Jerusalem, and therefore, ultimately, of course, to give the Jewish people the opportunity to rebuild the temple. Because it didn't happen. However, Christian believers at that time, because of the fact that he had become the leader of a new dynasty and the re-establishment of the emperorship, if you like, in France, Roman Catholic country, of course, there were Christian believers at that time who believed Napoleon to be the Antichrist because of all that was taking place. This is Ezra Sargent writing in 1809, and if you look at the front page of his treatise, actually he spells Antichrist incorrectly, but never mind. Identity of Napoleon and Antichrist completely demonstrated. And actually even the prophetic number, it's a little bit contrived, one would have to say, is found in his name, 666. That was definitely true of the Emperor Nero, by the way. But because of different ways of expressing the name of Napoleon, they could also come up with 666. Now that was Ezra Sargent in 1809. And this was George Stanley Faber, who was a prolific writer in the 19th century, who also felt that the reinstitution of the emperorship in France was an indication that Napoleon could well be the Antichrist. Of course, Napoleon actually died in 1821. This was 6 years after Faber actually wrote this treatise. So he changed his attention to Napoleon III. Now this is a book, this is a modern version of his book. That's what you see on screen. Napoleon III, who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man of prophecy. Or, subtitle, I think I've got that highlighted, yeah. Or, the revival of the French emperorship anticipated from the necessity of prophecy. Okay, that didn't happen, of course. But again, maybe we have archetypes, but in more modern history, of the Antichrist. Let's fast forward now, approximately 100 years. Who are we going to talk about now? We're going to talk about Adolf Hitler. I feel I got goosebumps at this point, because I think we're walking into an understanding that we need to fully appreciate. In my opinion, Hitler is the archetype of the Antichrist. For that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped. And of course, I highlight the words revealed, doomed to destruction, and exalt himself. Now we're going to apply these words to Hitler and see how it fits. He was revealed. He came out of almost nowhere, actually. It was interesting. And here in 1933, amazingly, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. And this is Hindenburg, of course, that he's with. If this is true, if he is an archetype of the Antichrist, he's also doomed to destruction. And of course, in April 1945, it is believed that Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. And of course, one could say that this is in fulfillment also of this prophetic motif described in the book of Daniel, which is repeating, recurring theme, yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. Of course, there have been conspiracies that actually Hitler might have returned. That was also true of Nero, by the way. I can't get into it now because I'd be here all day. Was he exalted? Did he exalt himself? Absolutely he did. Heil Hitler. Now this is really interesting to me because, of course, in the second letter to the Thessalonians, it says he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. And here you see a very interesting picture, which is Germany in the 1930s, or at least an example, which is an example of apostasy. Now I highlight this book. I have it to read. I've had it a few years. It's a very academic book. It's Susanna Heschel, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany. And actually, what this book is about is describing the establishment of the Institute for the Study and Elimination of Jewish Influence on German church life. And that institute was founded on May the 6th, 1939. It's a very academic book. It takes a lot of reading, this particular one. But in the process of eliminating Jewish influence, Jesus becomes the Aryan man. It was supported by many, particularly Protestant theologians. Of course, there were exceptions. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer and many others gave their lives to oppose what was being done. Now, that's not to say that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Zionist, because he wasn't. He was heavily into replacement theology, but ultimately he became a martyr because he stood against the tyranny that was being imposed. This is quite topical. Nevertheless, this is what took place in Nazi Germany. Interestingly, I've talked about this on other occasions. There was another handshake with the enemy. And of course, we know the person on the left, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. Took place in Munich, of course. And of course, this is part of a 7 years of tribulation. The question for us now is, when did it begin? When did it begin? Was it here, when Neville Chamberlain waved his piece of paper on his return to the United Kingdom? Was it here? Kristallnacht in November, the date chosen because it was a commemoration of Martin Luther's birthday, which is interesting to note. Was it here? Actually, I'm convinced, myself, people can disagree, that this 7-year period began at a conference. It's called the conference, the Evian conference, which took place in France, on Lake Geneva, in a first-class hotel, the Royal Hotel, which took place between the 6th and the 15th of July 1938. Here's a picture of some of the delegates. In anticipation of the Evian conference that was actually planned for over many months in 1938, this is what Hitler said in anticipation of the Evian conference. I can only hope and expect that the other world, what's the other world? That's the non-Nazi world, which has such deep sympathy for these criminals, will at last be generous enough to convert that sympathy into practical aid. We, on our part, are ready to put all these criminals, obviously talking of the Jewish people in the Reich, at the disposal of these countries, for all I care, even on luxury ships. However, I wonder if you know who this person is. This is a 40-year-old Golda Meir, who was the Palestinian delegate to the Evian conference. This is what she says. Sitting there in that magnificent hall and listening to the delegates of 32 countries rise, each in turn, to explain how much they would have liked to take in substantial numbers of refugees, and how unfortunate it was that they were not able to do so. It was a terrible experience. She goes on, I don't think that anyone who didn't live through it can understand what I felt at Evian, a mixture of sorrow, rage, frustration, and horror. I wanted to get up and scream at them all. Don't you know that these numbers are human beings? People who may spend the rest of their lives in concentration camps or wandering around like lepers if you don't let them in. This is a book that I'm reading at the moment. It was only actually published in 2020. It contains incredible information, documents that were locked away until very recently, the tragedy at Evian. And this is the subtitle of Tony Matthews' book. You can get it on Kindle, on Amazon. How the World Allowed Hitler to Proceed with the Holocaust. But what does God say? This is Jeremiah chapter 30. This is such a significant chapter, which talks to begin with about the time of Jacob's trouble, but he will be saved out of it. And then in verse 17, I will restore you. This is God's promise to the people of Israel. I will restore you to health and heal your wounds. And the Holocaust is an open wound even to this day. Why? Why will I do this? Because you are called an outcast, Zion for whom no one cares. And this was the outworking of the Evian conference. It's very dramatic reading. I would recommend the book. This, to my mind, is just incredible. If Evian begins the 7-year period, 42 months later, almost to the very day, there's another conference. January the 20th, 1942, just outside of Berlin, in this building, infamous conference, the Wannsee Conference. Isn't this amazing, folks, that I can be giving this talk today? Thank you so much for letting me do it. On Thursday last, the 20th of January, the Wannsee Conference had its 80th anniversary. And of course, what took place there in this one day? The final decisions were made with respect to the final solution. This is born out of Evian, folks. It's born out of Evian because the nations of the world, rather than let more Jewish people come into their territory, they actually tightened the restrictions and made it, in some cases, impossible for Jewish people to emigrate and to leave. Hitler wanted to get rid of them, but the nations were not cooperative, and therefore the final solution was decided upon at Wannsee. How awful that day will be. None will be like it. It will be a time of trouble for Jacob, but he will be saved out of it. This is great tribulation, folks. To think that this is still future betrays an ignorance, not least of the divine principle that we spoke about in the last few talks. But there's more. This, to my mind, is incredible. I didn't know any of this until you gave me this opportunity. Let's think. Wannsee, January the 20th, 1942. There is another conference to come. The conference is delineate the Holocaust, in my opinion. And there's another conference. What's that conference? It's Potsdam, which began on July the 17th, 1945, to determine the peace at the end of World War II. And you can see the political leaders, you know them by name, of course. Incredible. Evian ended on the 15th of July 1938. Potsdam began on the 17th of July 1945. 7 years, folks. This is a prophetic motif that continues, reoccurs. Potsdam ended on August the 2nd, 1945. How many days between Wannsee and the end of the Potsdam Conference? How many days? Well, you can do this yourself using a days calculator. Days calculator that you can get on the internet. You can fill in the start date. You can fill in the end date. Let's do it. Let's do it together. The start date, the 20th of January, 1942. That's Wannsee. The end date, the end of Potsdam, the 2nd of August, 1945. How many days? Press the button, calculate the duration. It's 1,290 days. I didn't know this until the preparation of this talk. 1290 days. What does it say in the book of Daniel? Daniel chapter 12. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. It's incredible. Of course, it's a repeating theme, but it was true in the Holocaust. The time of great tribulation, 1290 days. Yeah, delineated by conferences, I understand that. What did Jesus say? If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But, for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. 1290 days. But it goes on. This is Daniel chapter 12. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1335 days. As for you, Daniel, go your way until the end. This is the last verses in the book of Daniel. Definitely speaking of the future, folks. Definitely speaking of the future. Okay. Let's use the days calculator and see where we get to. Let's put in the Wannsee date, the 20th of January 1942, as the start date. We're looking for a different result. 1335 days this time. Where do we get to? We get to the 16th of September 1945. What happened on the 16th of September 1945? Well, in the first instance, there was a victory service in Westminster Abbey during that day. Okay. Significant, maybe. It's difficult for me to speak because I don't want to be presumptuous. But when I was waking up this morning, somebody was screaming in my ear, "Look up the biblical date, Geoff." And so that was the first thing I had to do today. The evening of the 16th of September 1945 was the beginning of Yom Kippur. And the shofar was sounded. Again, of course, it is on the Feast of Trumpets, but it's also sounded on the 10th day of the 7th month, which is Yom Kippur. That year was the 16th of September. This is what it says in the book of Leviticus. Then have the trumpets sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. Proclaim liberty throughout the land. Of course, particularly in the Jubilee year, actually. 1944 was a Shemitah year. We don't know exactly when the Jubilee years were. But it would have to be the year after a Shemitah year, that's for sure. 7 times 7 is 49, and it's the next year, which is the 50th year. Maybe, in God's eyes, the 16th of September 1945 was the beginning of the Jubilee. when liberty is proclaimed throughout the land. You see, the pattern of future tribulation is the Holocaust. That's why the Holocaust itself is a thing of the past. Time of Jacob's trouble will not be repeated. There will be global great tribulation, which will follow the pattern of the Holocaust, I believe. And as we approach International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is the 27th, and of course next Saturday will be the memorial event in the Minster, which we must be part of, I wanted to finish this talk reading these words. In the book of Hosea, "Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days." What does Peter say? After 2 days, he will revive us. And on the 3rd day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. And this is to be continued next time, whenever that is, because we're going to consider Global Catastrophe Part 6, I think it is, which I'm calling the final battle. And that's the talk for today.